Hi everyone, this is Savannah Betkowski, Project Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Preparing Winning Financing Applications for Water Infrastructure Projects. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCN provides training on technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for viewing the webinar today. This webinar has not been submitted to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. AWWA recommends that you check with your licensing agency to learn about its criteria, rules, and what you need to do in order to receive the credit for your attendance. It is your responsibility to verify this information with your licensing agency. If you need assistance in applying for credit to your licensing agency, please contact educationservices@awwa.org. You will receive an email from AWWA 10 to 30 days after this webinar with a link to access your certificate. And this Education Services email will be provided in the follow-up email. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that centers are spread all across the country from New York to Kansas to California. And here you can see the areas of expertise that the EFCN focuses on. Workshops, trainings, and direct technical assistance are provided on asset management, energy management planning, rates and finance, leadership through decision-making and communication, managing drought, water loss reduction, collaborating with neighboring communities, multi-funding, water conservation, management and finance tools and techniques, climate change resiliency, and workforce development. The EFCN also provides a small systems blog. You can learn more about water finance and management through this blog. Blog posts feature lessons learned from our trainings and technical assistance, descriptions of available tools, and small systems success stories. You can view this blog at the efcnetwork.org website. You will also have the opportunity to subscribe to this blog at the end of the webinar. In addition to workshops, direct technical assistance, and webinars, as part of the Smart Management for Small Water Systems projects, we are also creating a table that lists the major funding sources for drinking water infrastructure project in each state and territory. Here's how you can access those tables. On the homepage of the efcnetwork.org, you can go to Resources and then click on Funding Sources by State. This will take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state you are interested in, you will find a PDF table of the relevant funding sources for drinking water infrastructure in that state. The table will look like the image on the left hand of this slide. For each funding program, it will include the name of the program, a short description, and the contact information for someone who works in that program. And at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to our speaker for today. Today we have Stacy Isaac Barrazer, Senior Project Director at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina on Chapel Hill. Stacy, welcome and take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Savannah. Just making sure that we are seeing my screen.
Correct.
Okay. So as Savannah mentioned, hello everyone, first of all. My name is Stacy Isaac Barraza, and I work with the Environmental Finance Center that is based at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I do work from a remote office in the Atlanta metro area, but at the EFC you'll see an example here of some of our staff in this picture. We work with a lot of students every year, and we try to answer the how you pay for it question. At the EFC at UNC, we like to say that how you pay for an environmental project matters. It has implications in terms of policy, public education, etc. So we do our research and our work in a few different ways. We do a lot of applied research, we do teaching and outreach like today's webinar, and we do program design and evaluation as well. In terms of today's webinar, we'll be looking in terms of objectives at learning about different types of financing programs that are available to drinking water systems, particularly small systems like the folks on the webinar today. We also want to look at understanding some of the requirements that are related to federal funding programs. We'll talk about how federal dollars are just more and more in demand and how these programs are just increasingly competitive. So we're focusing today on how you can make your application be a cut above the rest. We'll highlight some tools that you can use to enhance your application and better plan for financial management at your drinking water utility. We'll look at tools to intentionally set your rate, good practices for setting rates, that is. We'll look at asset management a little bit, capital improvement planning, and we'll touch on customer affordability analyses as well. Okay. At this point, Savannah, do you want to do that polling question?
Of course. So I just sent out a poll, and if you could please answer, from which of the following does your water system currently have the most financing? And you can choose from a state revolving fund loan, a USDA loan or grant, a community development grant, or banks and bonds. And about 5 seconds left to input your answer. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And you can see those results, correct, Stacy?
I can't at the moment, actually.
Okay. Well, yes, so we have about 43% from an SRF loan. We have 20% from a USDA loan or grant. We have 7% from a community development grant, 14% from banks, and 16% from bonds.
Excellent. Okay, that's typically the sort of spread we see. Thanks, Savannah. So I'll continue then with the next slide. So we're looking at why borrow, why go to the debt market. A lot of you on the webinar today already participate in the debt market. Well, one of the reasons to participate or take on debt is that grant money is not likely coming from the federal government. So this chart here has really a lot of information. I want you to take away 2 main points though. One is that there's a lot more competition now for funds from the federal government. And secondly, your utility is going to have to generate a lot of the revenue on your own. So what you see here are 2 lines. The blue line is looking at state and local government spending on water and wastewater. And then the red line looks at federal government spending. You'll see that the red line hasn't increased much over time. Plus, the actual dollars that are provided by the federal government, they don't have as much purchasing power today as they did in the past. So while, 10 to 15, for a period of 10 to 15 years in the 70s and 80s, the federal government was providing substantial amounts of subsidized funding, mainly in the form of grants, to water and wastewater utilities. Today things have changed. Now the federal government provides more subsidized loan dollars, so complete grants are sort of a thing of the past in a lot of ways. And we're seeing that state and local governments are picking up more of the tab, if you will. So by 2014, for instance, according to this chart, we were seeing that state and local governments were spending, they were providing about 96% of all public spending for water and wastewater utilities. So that's one reason to look at the debt market. Another reason, or a couple other reasons, are that water infrastructure tends to have a long, useful life. Also, because of this long, useful life, amortizing the loan over the life of the equipment allows your customers to benefit from system improvements now and pay for them over time and into the future. So there are a few good reasons to consider the debt market when it comes to drinking water infrastructure. Basically, when you need cash now, the debt market is probably one of the options you should consider. And lenders are interested in 2 main things here that we're going to talk about. They're interested in your creditworthiness, so the possibility that you as a borrower may default on your debt obligations. That's what we're trying to measure with creditworthiness. They're also looking at your ability to repay the debt. In the case of local government or drinking water utilities in general, that ability to repay debt really comes from your rate setting practices. So we'll touch on rate setting as well today. We can sort of subdivide the debt market into 2 different types, loans and bonds. We won't talk about bonds too much today, but Loans are a little bit more universally available depending on the state that you're in. So a loan could be from a bank, but we're going to talk about loans that are government-sponsored programs on the webinar today. The first one would be the SRF program. So from the poll that Savannah took us through a couple minutes ago, a lot of the folks on the webinar have loans from the State Revolving Fund program that's run through the Environmental Protection Agency, and then a lot of you also have loans from Rural Development, which is out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which we anticipated. So we're going to spend some time covering these two programs, sort of an overview, and then show you where you can find information about other government funding programs. So if we take the SRF program first, or the State Revolving Fund program, there are actually two SRF programs. Today we'll focus on drinking water. So there's the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program, or DWSRF. And then there's the Clean Water sort of sister program. And that, when we say clean water here, what we really mean is traditionally wastewater and other sort of water quality projects. And both of these SRF programs represent a federal-state partnership. So the state provides a 20% match on federal dollars. And the programs are administered by staff in the specific state. With the Drinking Water SRF, it was established in the 1996 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act. All 50 states and Puerto Rico have some form of a drinking water SRF. Congress is the group that appropriates the funding for the program. Once the funds are appropriated by Congress, EPA awards capitalization grants to each of the states based on the Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey and Assessment. With what each state gets from the federal government, the bulk of the money, or the bulk of that capitalization grant, goes into a revolving loan fund. To give you an example, for the state of Utah, in 2000, for the period 2014 to 2017, their allotment is 1 400% of the whole federal pie for the Drinking Water SRF program. So it depends on different things in the state based on that needs survey and assessment. This is a diagram sort of showing the flow of the Drinking Water SRF. So you see at the top here that the federal government puts the initial funds in, the state has to match it by 20%, and then you have those low interest loans flowing out to water utilities across the country. They repay the loans. So this is the revolving piece of it. Technically, these funds exist into perpetuity because the loans are repaid, and you have some bond proceeds and bond repayments as an option in some cases as well. With the SRF, an important place to start is this intended use plan. So the IUP describes how a state plans to use the available funds with the SRF, and it includes a list of potential projects. The process involves the draft IUP being posted for public comment. What happens is usually the state gives each application a rating or a score, then the applications are ranked, and there's some sort of a priority list that's developed, usually included in this IUP. So if you are considering applying for the SRF program, it's really important to contact the folks in your state, and see how you may get onto this IUP and that list. With the SRF program, sometimes there may be a green infrastructure component where some of the funds are reserved specifically for green infrastructure projects. And by that term, we're looking at things like water efficiency projects, sometimes including new water meters. We're looking at energy efficiency projects in some cases. But Congress decides from year to year whether there's going to be this GPR or Green Project Reserve as a requirement. So you really need to kind of check back depending on the year you're planning to apply for funds. Some states exercise this option of having special rates and special incentives for disadvantaged communities. So the state would define what it means by a disadvantaged community, and there may be some incentives for these communities that essentially have low income. but not all states have disadvantaged communities programs. It's an option in the SRF program, but not all states take advantage of it. So you'd have to check with your specific state. In terms of how the State Revolving Fund program is operated, the additional subsidization that may exist from year to year, whether it's for disadvantaged communities or green projects or small systems, these subsidization options can be grants, principal forgiveness, or negative interest rate loans. Sometimes some states also change the term of the loan, so how long you have to repay the actual loan. We'll look at the next popular grant program, loan program that we had recorded on the webinar today. A lot of you seem to have rural development loans, so we'll talk a little bit about that program. Many rural communities rely on USDA's Rural Development's Rural Utilities Service Program to finance water and wastewater infrastructure improvements. While rural development does involve other types of projects, for example, you see on this slide here, they also have emergency funds sometimes in terms of grants. Here on this slide, you see a list of the eligibility criteria, or who is eligible to apply for these funds. So we really want to stress that rural development, like the name suggests, tries to keep this for rural communities. In a lot of cases, not-for-profit entities can apply, Native American tribes can apply, but in terms of cities, towns, municipalities, they're looking at rural areas with under 10,000 in population. It's sort of how they limit the applicants for their programs. And when we look at this number, 10,000 and below, actually, even though the whole program is exclusively rural, a lot of their loans and grants actually go to communities much smaller than 10,000. So here we're seeing 5,000 or fewer, or even 1,500 or fewer in population. The rural development program's interest rates are adjusted every quarter. And so I gave you some examples here. There are different interest rates based on poverty, intermediate, and market. And if you are interested in applying to USDA's Rural Development Program, you can go to the link that you see here and get the latest or current interest rates. In terms of how long you have to repay the loans, 40 years is sort of the rule of thumb, but sometimes state law influences that, or the useful life of the project. So some projects, maybe we don't expect it to have a useful life of 40 years, maybe it's 30, and so there are some adjustments that can be made there. With the Rural Development Program, you have to produce a preliminary engineering report. And I wanted to mention there's a grant program that through rural development that you can use to actually develop these PERs, as we call them. But also something that has been happening over the last couple of years is especially beneficial to, I think, small communities, where if you're looking at both SRF funding, for instance, and rural development funding, in the past you may have had to hire engineering firms to do different formatted reports. And so there's been a push lately to standardize this PER form so that you can hire an engineering firm to do one report, and you can use that report to apply both to EPA, some EPA funding programs, as well as rural development. And so that's something that you want to pay attention to. It reduces the cost, the engineering costs for the community. So there are several other programs that would relate to you, depending on the state that you're in. And Savannah went through off of the Environmental Finance Center network website, so the project website for the smart management for small water systems. We do have, according to instructions, how you can go and select the actual funding table for your specific state, where it says funding sources by state. And it would give you several other options for each state on where you might apply for funding. So we certainly don't mean to imply that these two programs are the only ones that you have options for. So do take a look at the other options there. You can download PDF charts from that web page. If The funds that you're looking at are federal, though. They usually come with certain strings attached. So, for example, with USDA funds, there's the PER that we talked about. There's an environmental report that's involved. And of course, because it's funding that you're looking for, there are financial and other documents that you have to produce. Davis-Bacon Act wage rules is also relevant. I provide here a URL where you can see the most recent wage determination. And those instructions on the slide really tell you how to find the wages and the rules for your particular community. American iron and steel provision is another one of the federal sort of strings. It requires iron and steel products in construction of projects to be produced in the U.S. There are waivers that can be granted, but there's a process involved there, so you would need to contact the folks in your state who are managing these programs and let them know that you're seeking a waiver, and they can kind of walk you through the process. There's a Q&A document that EPA has put out regarding iron and steel, and you see a link to that there. And we'll make these slides available afterwards, and so these links it'd be hyperlinks, and you can just click on them and access these documents. And EPA also has some training material on iron and steel in that provision for their funds. Disadvantaged business enterprises is another one of the what we call strings attached to federal funds. So typically we're looking for minority or women-owned businesses in this case. And so the requirement here is that these types of businesses must be given the chance to bid on any federally funded projects. It is not saying that you are required to hire disadvantaged business enterprises, but that they have an opportunity and a fair chance. So that's what the concept is behind this particular requirement. And with all federal funds come reporting requirements. So 3 major areas: DBE, the last slide we just looked at, this disadvantaged business enterprise area. You have to document that you have given those types of enterprises a fair chance to bid on your projects. American Iron and Steel involves reporting too, as well as Davis-Bacon. Something more recent is this idea of project signage. So if a project is funded through federal funds, there are some options, but you need to provide some sort of signage saying that these were federal funds. Okay, so we have sort of run through quickly a couple of the different programs, and again I want to encourage you to go to the website and look at your specific state and see if there are other programs that relate to you. So we just covered the 2 sort of more common federal programs that relate to drinking water systems in terms of infrastructure, but each state has programs as well. For example, I'm in Georgia, and there's a Georgia fund that's specific to the state. It's similar to the SRF program, but has some important differences as well. So that table for the particular state will highlight programs like that. But whatever program you're applying to for funds, we want to provide some tips on how you can score higher. The chart that we showed showing federal versus state and local spending, you would remember that there are fewer federal dollars to go around with more and more drinking water systems applying, so you need to make your application more competitive. And so we're going to look at some ways to do that now. This is an example, again, from the state of Utah. So when these federal programs, or any lender actually, is providing funds, they want to make sure that your utility has the capacity to carry out the project and to repay these funds over time. And so capacity assessment is a big deal. In the state of Utah, the state has actually created these capacity assessment worksheets for public water systems. So you can look at that link here, and you'll see specifically what a Utah utility would have to fill out in order to apply for, in this case, state revolving funds. This is just an example. It gives you an idea, though, of some of the things to think about on your application. It is directly something that you can consider what the funder is thinking about, what they're looking for in your application. So even if you're not in Utah, it can give you some tips. We're looking at capacity as well. Some of the questions you can ask yourself, as a utility manager or director, Is the water system that you're managing, is it self-sufficient? Are you able to cover your debt service after paying for your day-to-day expenses? If your customers stop paying their bills right now, how long can you maintain operations of the water system? Can your system meet its short-term obligations? How much of the useful life or the expected life of your system has already run out? These are the things that might keep a utility manager up at night. And fortunately, there are ratios to help answer some of these questions or track how you're doing in some of these areas over time. I wanted to point out this video. It is a whiteboard video on financial benchmarking specifically for water utilities, and it is about 11 minutes long and really tries to break this down in terms of everyday situations, a guy driving a car, for instance, and how he takes care of his vehicle. So it's been really useful for boards, apparently, to kind of boil down a lot of these concepts into something digestible in just 11 minutes. And it's graphic and visually appealing, I think. But another way to look at that, we're not going to look at the 11-minute video now. We will just look at some of these ratios individually. So is your system self-sufficient? To answer that question, we can look at the operating ratio. It's really a very basic ratio, operating revenues over operating expenses. This ratio can include or exclude depreciation, okay? And depreciation is looking at the cost of wear and tear on the system over time. In terms of the question, are you able to cover your debt service after paying for your day-to-day operations? Debt service coverage ratio is a good way to get at that question. So here you see the equation for that, how you calculate that. In this case, we'll say operating revenues minus operating expenses, and we leave depreciation out over principal and interest. The rule of thumb here, we recommend that debt service coverage ratio be greater than 1. Greater than 1.25 is probably ideal. Can your system meet its short-term obligations? It's another important question. And a ratio that helps address that one is the current ratio. So it's looking at unrestricted current assets, excluding inventories and prepaid items, over current liabilities. And on some of these ratios, you'll see a link at the bottom of your screen, and that is to a short blog post that's specific to this particular ratio. It gives you a little bit more context for the ratio if you want to look into these ratios a little bit more. How about the question, if your customers stop paying their bills today, how long can you maintain operations? And a good way to measure that is days cash on hand. So that looks at, let's say your billing system was to go down, or you had some sort of natural disaster like a hurricane. Water is an essential service. Obviously, you need to continue providing that service even if something like your billing system is down for whatever reason. So this gives you the number of days that you can continue operating your system. How much of your system's expected life has already run out? And that looks at asset depreciation. If you haven't looked at these types of ratios before and you're wondering where you get started, local governments have audited financial statements that you can go to. For non-governments, you want to look at balance sheets, you want to look at your shareholder reports, annual reports, and those kinds of financial statements to get the numbers that you need to calculate some of these ratios. For a long time, we were treating these ratios sort of individually and recommending that water utilities use them, measure them. It helps you to compare your utility to others, but probably more importantly, it helps you to compare, for example, if your operating ratio at your utility is doing better over time. Okay, we want to be going in a sort of progressive direction. And then eventually we came up with this tool that we call Financial Health Checkup for Water Utilities, where you hunt down these numbers and you put them into the spreadsheet once, and it tracks these different ratios for you over time. So, for example, for the operating ratio, you needed expenses. You put that number in once, and then other ratios get to be calculated based on that one input that you have. And then it provides these nice charts that you can see how these ratios are doing over time, depending on how many years worth of information you put in. When you try to download that, and all the Excel tools that I'll demonstrate today are actually available off of the EFC's website, and you can download them onto your computer and use them as you need, but you may get asked this question. When you first try to download the file, you'd have to click on Enable Editing at the top here. And usually it causes, we haven't had any problems with computers with that yet. Now, we kind of ran through these ratios. If you can include some of these ratios in your funding application, it would be helpful. Funders and rating agencies care about these ratios. Okay, so that's kind of answering this question about why should you care about them. Actually, a lot of these loan programs, for instance, they calculate some of these ratios. Something like a debt service coverage ratio, they always calculate that. They look at operating ratio to see if you are a good investment, to determine if you would be able to repay this loan that they're considering giving you. And as you think about the future needs of your system, let's say you're a system that's generating enough revenue every year and you don't need to go to the debt market anytime soon, it is good to know where you're starting from as you try to improve financial management of your system. Okay, what doesn't get measured, they say, doesn't get improved. So it's good to measure this and start keeping track of how you're doing financially. So now that we know where we are, because we've calculated these ratios, we can decide where we're going. How do we estimate the future costs and revenues? There are two related concepts here. One is asset management and the other is capital planning. And this is about working smarter, not necessarily harder. That's the essence of effective utility management or asset management, and those are terms that you may have heard before. So asset management, if we had to define it, we can say it helps you have the most impact in your system by spending your limited dollars in the best way possible. The key here is that most of us have, I would say, hazard to say all of us have limited dollars, right? We don't have unlimited amounts of cash, so we have to be smart in the way we spend these limited dollars. There are 5 core components of asset management, and this model was put together by the Environmental Finance Center out of New Mexico. And so they have given this sort of framework, if you will, for how to go about starting and developing an asset management program. So first you need to get a handle on the current state of your assets, even where your assets are. Some systems have been working with maybe one operator for a long period of time, and he or she may know in their head where the assets are. But part of this idea of current state of assets is figuring out what assets you have and where they are. And then we progress to this idea of level of service as well. And I'll talk about some of these in turn. But criticality is another important component of asset management, as well as life cycle costing and long-term funding, securing long-term funding. And that's a lot of what we're focusing on this webinar today, this idea of long-term funding and where you access those funds. With respect to the current state of assets, we're asking ourselves here, like I mentioned before, what does my system own? Where are these assets and what condition are they in? How much of the useful life is remaining? And what is the cost or the replacement value for these assets? It's not going to cost the same to replace an asset as when you bought it, say, 20 years ago. So you need to consider that. The idea of level of service is looking at measurable goals that you can track. So an example here would be how fast a water main break gets fixed, right? So if you haven't been measuring it before, you have to take a base measurement, sort of kind of time how long it takes from the time the break is reported to when you get it fixed, and then work on improving that. But the level of service, you may not want to say that you will repair water main breaks in 5 minutes, right? That might not be achievable, but you want to have some way of measuring that goal. So in this case, it would be time. How many hours or minutes in some cases does it take you to repair a water main break, for instance, and tracking that progress over time as you try to meet those goals that you set. Asset criticality is the probability or likelihood that a given asset will fail. So not all assets are of equal importance to utility. That's an important concept to remember here as well. How do assets fail, and what's the condition of the assets that you have right now? What is the consequence of an asset failing? So we're looking here at the cost to repair it. Are there legal consequences, environmental consequences, social consequences, and do you have redundancy in your system? For the most critical assets, you may have to have some sort of backup. An example here might be backup generators on some of your pumps. Based on some of those concepts, you can sort of rank your assets in a chart like this. So each asset can be evaluated in terms of its individual probability of failure and consequence of that failure. So the assets can then be plotted on this sort of quad chart based on the probability of a failure and the consequence of that failure. In this type of chart, the highest criticality or risk assets are those in the upper right-hand box. And the assets in the lower left are those with the lowest criticality or risks. The other two boxes are medium probability. So again, assuming that, like the rest of us, you have limited dollars, how do you decide which projects to tackle first? And a chart like this quad chart can help you to make some of those decisions. And going through this exercise and including something like this in your funding application for a loan, saying how you prioritize a particular project that you're requesting funds for, goes a long way in convincing the funder that you have thought about this process and you really need to do this particular project, and you know why, and it fits into the long-term plans for your utility. We'll talk a little bit about life cycle costing now as one of the components of asset management. So in theory, there's this exact time to replace an asset in terms of the cost or dollar values, right? Along the way, most assets need to be repaired, maybe where these X's are, over time. Like I said, in theory, this green arrow is probably showing you the optimal time to replace that asset. But it's not possible to know that optimal time to replace. So there's need to use the concept of risk. High-risk assets, you probably want to replace those before there's an actual failure. Whereas low-risk assets, you can run to failure and then replace afterwards because the risk is not that great. So here you see that we've changed the replacement point here until after the thing just breaks. So the fifth area of asset management we had talked about was long-term funding. So this is where capital planning comes in. Once you've figured out how to get the longest life out of your assets, when to replace different assets, you have to have a plan for how you'll get the money to actually replace them. And this asset management framework, you can get some more information on that on the link here. But we'll talk briefly about long-term capital planning. So a long-term capital plan is a multi-year document. It could be 10 years. We're seeing cases where in some states funding programs are asking for like a 20-year outlook on what you plan to do at your water system. And that document identifies and prioritizes these capital projects. And it's also important to identify, at least loosely, the funding sources and the timelines that you plan to get these projects done in. So that's basically what a capital plan is. The capital improvement program, with that you're looking at growth needs and how your system is going to be expanding over time. You're looking on the horizon to see if there are different regulatory issues that may be coming down. To do that, you talk to consultants, look at proposed regulations to see how you may have to generate additional funds to meet some of these requirements, okay? So if the federal government is looking to change, let's say, the limits that are allowed of a certain chemical or substance in drinking water, and your equipment right now cannot meet that new standard that might be proposed, then you may have to invest in some projects or some infrastructure to get there. And so that's what the whole capital improvement program process is looking at. And one of the things with water infrastructure and wastewater is that, you know, it's sort of hidden in a lot of ways. Hidden infrastructure tends to be ignored. And so that's another reason for kind of having these programs in place and keeping this planning at the forefront of your utility management. Okay, so a capital improvement program timeline, when you get to like a time frame of 5 years, you can be more detailed, right? Whereas if you're looking at 20 years, like I mentioned before, some agencies are asking utilities to look at 20 years. That's more of a plan. It's not going to be as detailed. It has to be more general because it's harder to predict what's going to happen in 20 years. When we're looking at a 5-year capital improvement plan, then we can be a little bit more specific. There can be more details in there. And you have to have a tighter plan for where the money will come from for these types of projects in a 5-year timeline. The capital improvement budget can actually be for an even shorter period. So that's 1 to 2 years is what we're recommending here. And that's committing funds for these actual planned capital improvement projects and getting that stuff approved or adopted. CIPs or capital improvement plans don't have to be too elaborate. This is an example here. I believe this comes from the EP. And it's just listing, you know, the equipment on one side and having columns looking at which fiscal year you're looking to do it in and what those things, those projects might cost. The previous slide is asking you to identify some prices. And in terms of finding the prices, you can call a vendor, or a few vendors might be better. You can ask other systems that may have embarked on a similar project to the one you're looking to undertake. And you can look at past expenses, but of course you have to adjust for increases in costs, right? So you can look at what you paid for some of that stuff in the past and increase the cost. In terms of how you increase the cost, there are a couple of measures of inflation that you can use. So a popular one that we hear about probably on a daily basis in the news is the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. Now that index is not as applicable, I would argue, to drinking water infrastructure projects, right? The CIP is based on a basket of goods for an urban consumer. It's like things like bread and transportation, which don't relate to a drinking water utility necessarily. The construction cost index is another index that we recommend if you're going to be looking at the price of things and inflation. And it's this one is looking at prices for labor and key construction materials from 20 different cities across the U.S. So it's more applicable to infrastructure at water utilities. And these two indices are not the same. They do not always behave the same. And that's the only reason I included this chart here, so that you could see, especially when we had the recession around 2009, they definitely behaved very differently. And that would have been an important time to kind of predict where things were going. So you don't want to assume that they behave the same. There are ways that you can look to drive down the cost of a capital improvement program. Maybe you can eliminate some projects. You can defer others. Instead of replacing a piece of equipment, maybe you can repair or refurbish it instead. So there are a couple other suggestions here on how you might drive down that CIP cost. And it's important too to consider that we are not operating these systems like we did 20 years ago. There are changes that we need to keep in mind. So we're finding that per capita use of water is decreasing, all right? Total demand is decreasing over time. So you want to reevaluate perhaps the water demands of your customers. There are lots of reasons for this drop in per capita consumption, and it has to do with conservation measures, but also just efficiency from changes in the plumbing code, for instance. So when you forecast how much water you'll be selling, what your customers will be demanding, you want to consider that as well. This is an interesting concept that I like to point out in terms of life cycle costing. So the idea here is that the purchase price is not equal to the total price. So we already talked about that, the purchase price of something 20 years ago is not going to be the new purchase price next year when you want to replace it. But also, you can't just look at the purchase price and that dollar value. There's more to having a piece of equipment and maintaining it, etc., than that original purchase price. So if we look at the cost against the asset life for a piece of equipment, this acquisition would be the cost for purchasing. Let's just say that's the purchase cost. But you also have to maintain the thing over time. And there's a cost involved there in maintenance. So that's what this blue area is showing. A lot of equipment needs to be refurbished at intervals over the lifespan of the thing. So let's say there are a couple of periods where you have to do some serious, beyond maintenance, actually refurbishing the equipment. And then lastly, and probably least, but something that I think a lot of managers are not thinking about is the disposal cost. So it may actually cost you something to get rid of this piece of equipment before you put the new one in, all right? And that's a cost to consider too. So we found like roughly this is about 35 to 40% of the cost that most folks have in their mind when they think of a piece of equipment and the cost involved. But that's less than half of what the thing costs you over its whole lifespan. So the 60 to 65% really is coming from refurbishing, maintenance, and disposal. So more than half of the cost. So I think that's a really important concept to keep in mind when we think about capital investments. In terms of asset management, the EPA has a software program called Checkup Program for small systems that you can download and use for free in terms of asset management for your small drinking water systems. Capital planning, I wanted to point out this resource page that the Environmental Finance Center at UNC has. It includes things about what you can include in your capital planning, and they're just different resources there, an Excel tool that you can use for getting started with capital improvement planning. It'll send you to this Excel tool that you could download. It's user-friendly, and it's for both water and wastewater utilities, what we recommend here. That CIP tool, when you put the necessary pieces of information in, you get some charts like the ones that you see here. So it looks at financial reserves, it sort of looks at the rate increases you'll need to be doing, and total capital expenses over time, etc. And we mentioned earlier, but if you get a loan even from one of these programs, whether it's federal or state, you need to repay that loan. And so you have to be thinking about how you're going to generate the revenue at the utility. And rate setting is really how you do that. Your rate setting process is very important. So in rate setting, we look at, will the new rate structure that we're considering provide sufficient cost recovery? We look at what does that term even mean? Are we following the applicable laws in our state? Are we allocating the cost to the right customers? So this is a question of equity. Will our customers understand the rates that we're setting? Will they not only understand but be able to afford or pay those rates? And do these rates send the right signals to our customers based on the objectives of our community? And then this is one we added more recently, will the revenues be resilient to changing water demand? So I talked about the drop in per capita use of water, and then resilience also has to do with things like natural disasters and how we can weather those storms, if you will. Full cost pricing is an important consideration when it comes to your rate setting. You want to set rates that you not only cover operations and maintenance, but ideally you're working towards your rates covering even things like source water protection. So this is sort of a continuum here. If you're looking at funding applications and getting loans, principal and interest on long-term debt is very important as well. Your funders will want to see that you can do that with your rate structure. We recommend always that you actually write out, so take the time to go through this exercise where you rank your rate setting objectives. If it's encouraging conservation and full cost pricing, those kind of go hand in hand. If you're looking at full cost pricing or full cost revenue, full cost recovery, I should say, that coupled with maintaining affordability, those two may be sort of at odds with each other. So you may have to get a little bit more creative in how you achieve certain objectives that may seem to kind of contradict each other, if you will. But it's really useful to write this out as a board or decision-making body for your utility so that you're all on the same page with your objectives and how you rank them. In terms of setting rates, we like to talk about these different elements of rate structure design. So you want to look at your customer classes, your billing period, the base charge, and several other elements to consider. And another thing to remember when you set rates is that when you increase rates, there's going to be a change in demand. So when you set rates based on projected water use, when you raise the rates, it's going to lower water use a little bit. By how much? We think somewhere around 3% of a decline in water use with every 10% increase in rates is a good rule of thumb. So don't expect to sell as much water as you were selling before if you have a rate increase, is the point here. We also recommend that you look at your rates every year. You may not change them, but at least review them every year. And a tool to help with the rate setting is this water and sewer rates analysis model. So it kind of looks like this. You put some information in, just sort of typical EFC at UNC Excel-based tool. You put information in and it generates, so this is data input 1, the screen. And at the end, this model will spit out for you the fund balance under the existing rate structures that you have compared to the fund balance under the proposed rates. And it's projected over a long time period. Here's that 20-year number coming back again. So it projects this rates and the fund balance over the next 20 years for you. So it lets you consider different rate structure options if you're looking at a rate change. And we want to talk about affordability as well for a little bit. If you are applying for loans or even a grant, especially grants actually, it helps to show that there are affordability concerns for the community that you're serving. So I wanted to point out a couple of charts here. This is from the Water and Wastewater Residential Rates Affordability Assessment tool that you can get from the website, and I'll show you the URL in a second. But for example, this chart here is showing the affordability for water and wastewater rates in a sample community, and we're looking at 5,000 gallons of use per month and 2015 income levels. So the tool helps you to pull census data for, in this case, 2015. 2016 data isn't available yet. And it shows the percentage of customers that are spending what percentage of their income on water and wastewater. It also will generate a table like this. And so this example is from Atlanta, the city of Atlanta in Georgia. And it shows key socioeconomic indicators. So we have MHI, median household income, which has limitations, but it also shows, rates for water and sewer based or compared to unemployment, Social Security income, folks on the food stamp program. So it gives you more of a holistic picture of affordability for your given service area. And to access the tool, you go to this website right here. If you click on that link, it should take you directly to it. So I also wanted to mention here, there is, if you go to this webpage, there is a recorded webinar on how to use this tool so you can get more information there. But the point is, for example, USDA's programs, the rural development, they have the option of giving you a partial loan and then a small piece of grant. And their grant funds disappear pretty quickly, as you can imagine. The grant funds are highly subscribed to, and they go first. In terms of convincing a funder that you are a good fit for getting some of their limited grant dollars, you can use charts like this. So basically, the red here shows that this is most stressed. I should highlight this. Values in red on this tool that you didn't create, right? It's a third party, it's the EFC at UNC that's put this tool together. Values in red here indicate that the indicator is most stressed as compared to both the state and national average. So it's helping you make the case for why you may be a good candidate for grant funds, or for some of the other tools, why you are a good investment because you have your house in order financially and you will be able to repay the loan funds that you're borrowing. And I know Savannah probably has another polling question, and we have, I think, a couple minutes for questions as well. So Savannah, I'll turn it back to you right now.
Thank you, Stacy. So we don't have any questions as of right now, so please input any questions that you can think of. But before we do wrap up, there are 2 more quick polling questions. And the first one is if you would like to subscribe to the Environmental Finance Center blog. If you want to sign up for the blog but don't have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can sign up for the blog on the efcnetwork.org website. And getting ready to close that poll in 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And the next quick question is if you are a small water system of 10,000 or fewer people served, would you be interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? And again, if you're unsure about technical assistance or do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can review the technical assistance form on the efcnetwork.org website. And getting ready to close the poll in 5 seconds. Closing in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, in the chat box, there will be a survey link and the CEU email. If you have any questions about the CEUs for how to receive them, it should all be in that chat box. And so, Stacy, I did just get a few questions. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's see what we can answer.
All right. The first one is, how do you access the financing sources by state tables again? I can't find them on your website.
Okay. Why don't I try to demonstrate that sort of live here? Okay. So, yeah, this is actually the affordability assessment tool that I mentioned. And this is the video that you can use to see how to use that. But if we go to EFCN, and N is the first letter in the word network.org, so efcnetwork.org, you go to resources, you can click on funding sources by state, and then what you do is click on your particular state, and you'll find a PDF table pops up. So this is
much.
I will let me just pull up one other one. Yeah, this is what they more typically look like in terms of the white and blue color coordination, and it has the name of the organization, the name of the program, couple sentences on the purpose of the funds, how you apply, and the website, and then probably most importantly an actual contact person with email and phone number to get in touch with. All right, Savannah.
So we did just receive one more, and an attendee asked, do you have any suggestions for useful life for technology, CIP, such as SCADA, SCADA?
Mm-hmm. I do not. I don't use SCADA myself, but I certainly hear a lot of utilities talk about it. What I'd recommend is going to the folks who sold it to you, or going to the SCADA website, for instance, and looking to see what, new versions of the program cost. But also, they would probably be able to give you an idea of the life cycle or the lifespan of those. And if there is an alternative out there, an alternative technology, you probably want to check with those software companies to see what they recommend. In reality, and this goes for actual equipment and hard infrastructure too, you may get water meters and the expected life may be 20 years from the manufacturer, right? So in other words, I'm saying with the software, you look at the software company that sold it to you and you ask them how long they expect it to be useful for. So you can do the same thing with, infrastructure like water meters. And that's a great place to start, whatever the manufacturer has said. But you can talk to other folks who've used that software or that infrastructure as well, and or that equipment, and see what their actual experience has been. So maybe it said 20 years for water meters, but the utility next door who's replaced them, and they are in a similar geographic area, and they have similar temperature differences or temperature changes to your utility. They may find that, our weather or climate is really easy on these water meters, let's say, and so we're actually getting 25 or 30 years out of them. So that's, that's a little bit of a better estimate. And then ideally, when you put those water meters in, you might see, based on your system, that you're getting, 18 years out of them. So they're different progressions. But if you want, the best place to start is looking at the provider, the software provider, or the equipment manufacturer, and seeing what they estimate the useful life is, and starting there, and then building off of that from others' experience, other utilities' experience, and then your own system's experience.
Thank you, Stacy. So there are a few extra questions, but we are running out of time, so we'll have to follow up with you offline via email. I just want to thank you again, Stacy, for the in-depth look at preparing a top-notch application for water infrastructure projects, and thank all the attendees online with us today. Stacy, do you have any additional closing comments?
No, I hope folks can see my contact information on the screen right now. And yeah, we'll try to follow up with the folks who we couldn't get to your question today. We apologize, and we'll try to reach out to you directly. Thanks, Savannah.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.